English writer William Foe, in his 1823 book Memorable Days in America, is believed to have been the first to popularize the name the Wild West, and ever since, the story of the Wild West has become something of a cultural phenomenon. But what was the real story? Well, in this short history, through 12 facts about the Wild West, I'm going to tell you. But before I do, first you've got to remember to subscribe to my channel. Nobody can say for definite when the Wild West took place. The Wild West became a nickname for the American frontier, which means that the Wild West is actually the story of the American frontier. And this is where things get properly complex for working out when it actually took place, you see. Whereas it's widely agreed that the story of the American frontier and so the Wild West ended in 1912 when Arizona gained statehood, there are four arguments for when it began. The first is that it began in 1540 when the Spanish conquistadors first ventured north out of the newly colonized Mexico. The second is that it began in 1607 with the formation of Jamestown by the English. The third is that it began in the 1750s when a small band of British settlers left the 13 colonies and set out across the Appalachian Mountains in search of new lands to colonize. And the fourth and final is that it began in 1803, which was the year when America purchased what was known as the Louisiana Territory from the French First Republic. The popularized Wild West era has fairly set dates. The main Wild West era, more commonly known as the archetypical era, is the era that Hollywood first popularized, and though some argue that it began in 1848 with the annexation of the southwestern territories from Mexico with it ending in 1912, the majority put the dates for it between 1865 and 1890 and thereabouts. The Wild West never had a set location, and this is true even for the archetypical years. Because the Wild West tells the story of the American frontier, inevitably it doesn't per se have a set place for where it took place. This is because, of course, that the American frontier was constantly changing. For example, the area English writer William Foe in his 1823 book referred to as the Wild West was the American Midwest, specifically Kentucky, Ohio and Illinois, which were very much frontier lands at the time. That means to tie down a place for the Wild West you need a date, and even then it's difficult. This problem can be especially seen when looking at the archetypical years over which we are supposed to have the most clarity, you see. Some argue everywhere west of the Mississippi River should have been classed as having been the Wild West during these years, but others argue that the main stories took place in only 13 of these states, and so only these states should be treated as the Wild West during these years. And if you want to know the names of those states, they are Dakota, Nevada, Oregon, Utah, Idaho, Montana, Arizona, California, New Mexico, Colorado, Kansas, Oklahoma, and of course Texas. What made the archetypical Wild West era so unique was the crazy number of things that all happened at the same time. During the archetypical Wild West era, firstly, you had the story of the great cattle drives and the Cowboys. Secondly, you had the crazy amount of fighting that took place between the US military and Native Americans. Thirdly, you had the mass migration into the Western territories that took place. Fourthly, you had the US government working to centralize power and the chaos that wrought. And fifthly, you had the crazy amount of industrialization going on. So think the building of railroads, towns, cities and things like that. And the crazy thing is, all of this was happening at the same time. So in this short 20-year period or so, which was what made the era so unique from a historical perspective. The Civil War gave birth to the great cattle runs of the Wild West. At the outbreak of the American Civil War, the Union-held territory found itself with a big issue. That big issue was that the majority of cattle farms were in Confederate-held territory, and the result of this issue was that the price of cattle in the North went through the roof. In fact, by the end of the Civil War, the cost of cattle was 10 times higher in the North than in the South, and this created an immense opportunity for cattle owners in the South to make big profits. All that was needed was for them to get their cattle to the North. The problem was the railroads had not yet connected their state to the rest of America. Step fourth, the cowboy and the great cattle runs of the Wild West. The first large one took place in 1866, with the aim being to get the cattle from Texas to a railhead in Chicago. And though it failed, it started a trend that saw tens of millions of cattle transferred from the western states to railroads for transportation around the country. And the craziest thing about these runs is that by the 1890s they were pretty much over, mainly because by that point not only had the railways reached every point of America, but the price anomaly that led to the trade being so profitable had well and truly ended. Town and city folk were the majority during the archetypical Wild West era. Of the 10 million or so that lived west of the Mississippi River during the peak Wild West years, the majority were a mixture of town and city folk, regular old farmers, soldiers, mine workers, and of course those who worked in construction. So think things along the lines of railroad workers, builders, infrastructure workers, and things like that. So not cowboys or adventurers or outlaws, just regular old folk, and the main story of the West was probably one of regular folk doing regular things. Cowboys only made up a very small number of your populace of the archetypical Wild West era. Most estimates only put the number of cowboys at a total of 40,000 at the absolute most, and that was during the peak cattle drive years, so the 1870s and the early 1880s. That means that during the archetypical era, cowboys at most made up only about 0.4% of the population living in the West. Crime rates in the Wild West during the archetypical era were not high for the time. Historians have found that crime rates west of the Mississippi River during the peak Wild West years were on average no higher than any other place in America at the time. There were of course a few outliers like Dodge City in the 1880s, but across the board they were not outside of the norm. That means the story of the Wild West, even the archetypical years, was not one of lawlessness, which when you think of it makes a lot of sense, as people would not have moved there in such large numbers if it had been. Bank robberies were rare in the archetypical Wild West. The Foundation for Economic Education did a study into the archetypical Wild West era and found that there were only 8 definite bank robberies that took place between 1859 and 1900 across 15 frontier states. Yep, just 8. To put this into perspective, in America today, there are thousands of bank robberies each year. The name cowboy was an insult in the Wild West. During the American War for Independence, guerrilla groups made up of farmhands operated in Westchester County, which is the territory that marked the dividing line between the British and American forces. These groups had differing loyalties. On the one side were the Skinners, who fought for the pro-independence side. On the other side were the Cowboys, who supported the British. Both sides had a penchant for ambushing convoys and stealing horses and cattle. However, the Cowboys were especially skilled at this, with them capturing the convoys and turning them over to the British, and this led them to being seen as outlaws and thugs by the pro-independence side, and as a result of this, the idea of cowboys being outlaws and thugs stuck around. Cowboys in the archetypical Wild West were not called cowboys unless they were black. Because calling someone a cowboy was an insult, during the archetypical years, cowboys were more commonly referred to as cowhands, drovers, or stockmen, unless of course they were black, in which case it was deemed okay to refer to them as cowboys, and racism was the reason. You see, though the Union victory in the Civil War had seen slavery abolished in America, during the era of slavery, black men had typically been referred to as boys regardless of age. As cowboy was already seen as a derogatory term at the time, no doubt it makes sense why black cowboys of the era were referred to as cowboys rather than cowhands like their white counterparts. And yep, rather crazily, that means technically the only real cowboys in the Wild West were black men, because at the time they were the only people who were typically called cowboys. White men were the minority when it came to cowboys. Work as a cowboy was hard. Not only were the hours ridiculously long, when you were on the trail you would be frequently trapped in the blazing sun for days on end with an endless flow of dust blasting you in the face. Yep, I know, sounds like fun, and the fun doesn't end there either. To top it all off, as a cowboy, your life would be at constant risk, not per se from Native Americans outlaws like in popular belief, but from being caught in a stampede. Yep, cattle were big killers during the Wild West, at least for cowboys, but I know what you're thinking. The pay must have been good to compensate for all this, right? Well, wrong. You see, a cowboy just starting out could expect to earn only about $20 per month, which in today's money would be only about $450 a month. Even an experienced cowboy would only expect to be able to earn about $40 a month. Needless to say, the low pay tended to attract only those who had little other options. This is why it's believed that up to 25% of cowboys were black, and as many as 40% were either Mexican or Mexican American. I should add there were also believed to be a decent number of Native American cowboys, and if you add all this together, what you end up with is white cowboys only making up a third of the total number of cowboys during the archetypical Wild West years. That's all from me. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this, remember to give it a like and subscribe to my channel, because the more who do so, the more of these videos I can make. Is that a good bribe? I hope it is. See you next time.